I always begin by saying that I hope everyone is taking very good care. Some people say that what we're experiencing these days is the new normal. I suggest that it's not normal at all. In fact, it's very disruptive. But we do know that these disruptions continue to occur, whether they are pandemics or natural disasters or things of that sort. So again, in this new unusual, I hope that you, your loved ones, classmates, and colleagues continue to take good care of one another and of course of yourselves. Some have heard me say this, we have to put on our own oxygen masks to take care of others. And that's particularly important for those who are caring for others, and in many cases that does pertain to women. I also want to share the acknowledgement and to thank all of our frontline workers and our workers behind the scenes. Those people who are keeping us all safe, whether we're in our homes, our delivery workers, the people who clean the hospitals, and of course our hospital and healthcare workers. I would also like to take a moment to honor those who've come before us, our ancestors and the indigenous peoples whose land we now sit upon and occupy. I also want to honor those whose lives have been lost in recent acts of violence, whether that's anti-Black violence, xenophobia, etc. Those who are known and those who are also unknown to us. So please join me in 10 seconds of silence in recognition and honor. Thank you. Tonight's panel is part of two initiatives at NYU, NYU Votes and NYU Women 100. NYU Votes was launched in 2018 with the goal of giving every single eligible NYU student the opportunity to cast their ballot. Please visit nyu.edu/NYU-votes for resources and instructions to keep our student voting community informed of the deadlines and processes for both registering and voting. And we are dropping the links in the chat as we go along. The second initiative, NYU Women 100, is a university-wide effort that situates the year-long commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment as a moment to reflect and contextualize this historic centennial with a broader intersectional and global history of women's fight for gender equality. We celebrate the achievements, the innovations, and the paths forged, and the possibilities that are being created by so many. We honor women who have been historically overlooked as well across our global communities, women of transgender, non-binary, and cisgender experiences, women of color, women on the margins. So you can imagine that I'm thrilled and have been very much looking forward to this rich discussion today on women in the vote. The current pandemic and the social conflict and protests around racial violence, and of course, around all of the other things that are impacting so many communities, including women, women in research, women's publications, and of course, and women at home. So to really foreground the ways in which intersectionality compounds the vulnerability of women and women of color at this time here in the US and globally, and what that has to do with the vote. So tonight we will focus on why women using their vote is a vital action to transform our future and our nation's position within global communities. Women voters may very well determine who wins the 2020 election, the power of women. The 2018 elections were dubbed the Year of the Woman. 102 women were elected in the state to the House of Representatives and 14 to the United States Senate. While we celebrate the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution this year, by which some women gained the access to vote, there were still some women who were substantially underrepresented and continue to be in our elected offices. So now is also our time to think about what we can do. National surveys of women in the United States reveal that health, gender-based violence, workplace equity, and intersectional issues of racial and socioeconomic justice are priorities for women across party lines. Gen Z. Those who know me know I love talking about the generations, and I certainly love talking about emerging generations. And Gen Z women register higher levels of concern for their personal and economic security than previous generations. And since they are our future and will be voting, the Gen Zs and will influence the Alpha generation. Again, now is the time to pay attention to the emerging generations. We are also experiencing exacerbated disparities that I mentioned in the fore, and xenophobia during this pandemic, and the pervasive systemic anti-Black violence and racism in the United States. And we've seen protests across the globe in relation to this kind of anti-Black sentiment. There's much work to be done, but I feel vitalized by the momentum and awareness that continues across, as I said, so many parts of the world. We are in a historic voting year, navigating these disparities exacerbated by COVID-19, and acutely aware of the social action and transformations that are needed in the United States. So thank you to our panelists in advance. Thank you to Claudia, Brianna, and of course, Charlotte, for the contributions that you're about to make. I also would just like to thank my amazing team in the Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation, OGI for short. We are thrilled to partner for this program, and thank you to all of our partners. Some of the sponsors are listed at the front. I'd like to thank the John Bredeman Center and our School of Law, and of course, our Center for Black Visual Culture and the Institute of African American Affairs, and Federal Hall, Debate Defends Democracy. And I have to thank my partner, my friend, my colleague, Ellen Toscano. Thank you, Ellen, for all the great work you've done on this program, but all the great work that you do across the university, and for all of your contributions. You are truly an incredible NYU citizen. And then, of course, I will turn the program over to Betsy Fischer Martin, our moderator, who will begin the panel discussion and introduce our full panelists of guests. Betsy Fischer Martin, is an Emmy-winning journalist and former TV news executive at NBC's Meet the Press, the longest running program in television history. She is currently the executive director of Women and Politics Institute at the American University, and the executive in residence for the American School of Public Affairs, where she teaches courses on political communication. She also teaches media skills for SPA Analytics and Management Institute. Betsy, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being such a great partner. And I am looking forward to this discussion. I turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's always great to talk with my friends at NYU. And thank you for setting the table so perfectly for our discussion this evening. Welcome, everybody. As Lisa said, we want to speak more broadly about women in politics today to discuss the participation of young female voters and the political impact that they have had and will continue to have by making their voices heard in this political landscape. And we're fortunate to be able to discuss this through the prism of three accomplished young women who have really been on the front row of politics and public service. Brianna and Claudia as political activists, and Charlotte as a journalist who's been traveling around the country talking to voters during this election. Let me start briefly with Charlotte's bio, introduce her as a journalist. She is the national correspondent with Time Magazine, where she covers youth social movements, women in politics, and the grassroots left. The perfect combination to talk about today. She is also the author of a terrific book on these very topics called The Ones We've Been Waiting For: How a New Generation of Leaders Will Transform America. And so we're delighted that she could be here with us. And Brianna Cea is the CEO and co-founder of Generation Vote, where she educates, mobilizes, and connects young people to become agents of change in local electoral and advocacy campaigns. She is also the co-chair of Let New York Vote Youth Voting Rights Working Group, the largest voting rights coalition in New York State, and which is responsible for passing the first New York voter reform laws in over 100 years. And she's also, in her spare time, a research and program associate at the Brennan Center for Justice. So thank you, Brianna, for being here. And also thank you to Claudia Cereceda. She is a proud NYU alum, class of 2016. After graduating, she worked as a special assistant to the First Lady of the City of New York, and then as regional operations director in the mayor's office. In this past election, she worked on the National Regional Operations Desk for the Elizabeth Warren for President campaign. I'm sure she has some great stories about that. She's currently a public policy student here at NYU's Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. So thank you to the three of you all for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. So I want to start with Brianna and Claudia first, just to ask them as young women, why you all think it's important to be active and engaged in politics, and what did that path look like for you all specifically? Claudia, do you want to start?
Sure. I think to answer your first question, it's important because we're such a large voting bloc, right? Mm-hmm. So 18 to 29-year-olds are the largest voting bloc in the United States. So we have the power and the ability to shape and change these elections. And so for me, the path that I kind of took to get involved, I was never particularly engaged in politics before, coming to NYU as an undergrad. And in fact, it was when I was at NYU Florence that I got particularly engaged over the topic of immigration. So they were facing the migration crisis. And for me, it was very plain and simple, a humanitarian issue. I thought, people are fleeing their country due to persecution, due to war, and Europe has the ability to help them. Plain and simple, they should help. But as I got, more information and I ended up doing my senior thesis on the topic, I realized it was extremely political, right? Not every country wanted to help. Some countries said, this is not our problem. And the coastal countries like Italy and Greece got burdened with these very large numbers of people fleeing to Europe. And I thought, this is interesting. And I realized that no matter what the issue was, everything, has a political angle to it. And it's important, for whatever issue for me, at that time it was immigration, to figure out who has the power, those are those in government, and, what are they doing to address these issues? And if you dislike that, how are you getting involved to, have your voice be heard? Right. And for me, that was really important. And, that's how I ended up getting involved in the mayor's office and then joining, Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign last fall, because it matters, right? And it's important that we lend our voices to the topics and to the issues that we care most about.
Great. Thanks, Claudia. Brianna, what about you?
Awesome. Thank you, Claudia. Yeah, and I really appreciated Dr. Coleman's opening, grounding us in remembering those who came before us. So to answer your question about why I think it is so important that young people, particularly young women, Generation Z, I'm a member of Generation Z, so I see you all out there on TikTok and whatnot. I think it's really important because not only does it shape our future, but also recognizing the legacy and the sacrifices of those who came before us. In the lead up to this event, I was thinking a lot about the centennial of the 19th Amendment and how just 100 years ago, we women got the right to vote, but it wasn't all women. And so as we approach this general election in November and think about why it is so important for people like me, who look like me, to get involved, I remind myself that 100 years ago, that movement at the time benefited mostly white middle-class suffragettes. And it was a long, still unfinished journey to fight for our right to vote and to fight for a life of dignity. It wasn't until decades later that Asian American women, that Black women, that Latina women got the right to vote. And so when I go to the ballot box, I remember that. And that's why for me, it's so important. And in terms of how I got involved, my family was always grounded in community. They always taught me at a young age, like in the Girl Scouts and all those community service organizations, to serve your community in some way. And so as I got older, I viewed politics as a way to serve your community without wearing a uniform, right? Not all heroes wear capes. Sometimes they are in political office or they're getting you out to vote. And so I got involved in local campaigns in my time at Binghamton University, which is a SUNY school in upstate New York. And in that community, it wasn't normal for young people, especially people that look like me, to get involved in local politics. And so when I showed up, people were a little weirded out that there were young people on the scene really challenging the way that the local parties were running their local campaigns. And as a result of that, we created what is now known as the Gen Vote model of engagement to train young people in upstate New York at the time to get involved in local politics and advocacy campaigns. But while we were doing that, and while we're trying to get young people out to vote, we realized that young people were having trouble just even accessing the ballot, whether it be getting to poll sites in the first place, or at the time, dealing with New York's archaic electoral systems. And as a result of that, Generation Vote then kind of dove headfirst into fighting for youth voting rights. And that's how I got involved in this fight today.
That's great, Brianna. Charlotte, let me ask you, as you travel the country and talk to young voters, young women, do you have a sense of what they're looking at this election? Are they thinking that this election is going to be critically important to them? What are you hearing from young women as you make your way across various campaign sites in the country?
So one of the things, and I should sort of preface this by saying I'm very, and I think that this is important for thinking about this. So I'm very specifically going through the swingiest parts of the swingiest states.
Right.
So that's like, the suburbs of Milwaukee and, parts of Michigan that were Obama, Trump. And I haven't gotten to Pennsylvania yet, but I'll figure that out when I get there. So one of the things that is an unfortunate reality in our political system is that the people who are doing, in some ways, the most sophisticated thinking about young women in politics and what it means, and how young women can move the ball forward. Many of those people live in already extremely blue areas. And frankly, one of the things that I explore in my book is that there's a real geographical generational divide, where the places that young people tend to be concentrated in cities, often on the coasts,
right.
Even not in coastal areas. You have way more young people in Detroit than you do in Holly, Michigan, which is right near where I am now. And that means that, those places that have, a disproportionate impact on the election outcome actually have these older, whiter populations who are maybe not interrogating this as much. And it's also important to remember that 52% of white women voted for Donald Trump last year. So, and women really are not a monolith, obviously.
Sure.
And I think age is one of the things that can carve up the white woman demographic as well, because younger white women, do tend to be leaning more to the left. But there are a million different ways to look at this prism, and it's really exciting to hear from both of you about what you're seeing as well.
So just to peg off of that a little bit, when we think about actual turnout of younger voters and younger women voters, we know from 2016 that was some of the lowest voting rates on record in the past 2 decades, with only about 55%, I think, of the voting age citizens casting ballots. And those who did vote were disproportionately, as you mentioned, Charlotte, white and older, right? In fact, 36% of young 18, 19-year-old first-time voters, that was it. 36% of them turned out, and older voters were much more higher rate of turnout. So I guess let me ask Brianna, because you're involved so much in kind of the voting registration efforts, the get out the vote efforts. Why do you think there was such a lack of participation in 2016, and then it increased so much in 2018? And do you see that trajectory continuing to increase?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say that I am excited, because since 2016, I think a lot of people my age, including my friends, who would at the time laugh at all of my hysteria around the 2016 election, trying to get them out to vote, right? Or just shake them in my door and be like, you don't understand, this is our future. I think something clicked the day after Election Day. And since then, we have seen a lot of young folks realize how important it is to turn out. And that's why we saw, historic turnout in the 2018 midterms for young people, where about over 30% of young folks turned out. And I think that's super promising for 2020. In terms of 2016 and what are some reasons why we saw such low turnout, I think one thing that not a lot of folks are aware of and really talk about in this conversation around the youth vote is this, years long, since 2010, campaign across the country to suppress the youth vote. There's a lot of hype around the youth vote, and a lot of people are pouring in millions of dollars to turn out people my age. But what not a lot of folks are realizing, that it's one thing to register us to vote and to tell us to get out the vote, But what about educating people about their right to vote and understanding that young people, like Gen voters that I work with, like my friends, face very unique barriers, and some of those barriers are intentional. Things like not having accessible poll sites if you are a college student and you want to vote in your local election, but you have to drive 30 minutes away or
Right.
walk, miles. And so, we have seen these increased efforts to suppress the youth vote since 2010, if not earlier, in states across the country. And I think we saw that play out in 2016. I'm hopeful that, due to litigation and more educational efforts since 2016, young people are more aware, and as a result, hopefully can overcome these barriers in the upcoming election. But I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon. And that's why we need more young folks talking about not only getting out the vote, but what does it mean to fight for our right to vote,
Right.
post the 2020 election.
And it's not easy. It's not as easy to distinguish, those two kind of voter suppression. You've got sort of the hard voter suppression, right? That's like voter ID laws. And then you have more of the softer voter suppression, which you mentioned, that not knowing where polling sites are, or college students that go to polls and they're being asked for an unduly amount of, proof of residency, those kind of things. And so I'm wondering, how do you try to work and change some of that? Is it just through education of the individual voter, or what else can be done to help young people have the access to the polls that they need?
Yeah, and this is for me?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so I think the most important thing, especially in the lead up to November, like the most immediate thing is that grassroots organizers, whether it be students on campuses or just young people more broadly in our communities, are making sure that people have the right information about how to vote, especially in this election. I think there's a lot of confusion about how to vote safely, whether it be in person, whether it be early or vote by mail. I think the first thing is that, and even to overcome some of these barriers, just got to make sure that people have the right info of the current systems that exist, the current voting systems that exist. In the long term, what we've been doing in New York State as a potential model for folks that can fight for youth voting rights across the country is really push organizers to think about reforms that can advance youth voting rights. This can look like things such as passing online voter registration or having online AVR, automatic voter registration in your state, right? Working with grassroots organizers to call your legislators for these important reforms, like mandating on-campus poll sites, right? Across the state legislatures can do that.
Right.
So I think in terms of the long-term game, if we can educate young people not only about like literally how to vote and get out the vote, but also what voting laws exist. Did you know that other states actually have OVR, but New York, we currently don't? The bill passed last year, but it's not going to be active for another year or so. And so, really, challenging and calling us state legislators to demand for these reforms that will ultimately make it easier for not just young people, but also, voters of all eligible voters to vote, especially voters of color. And so those are kind of my two-pronged approach. Educate folks now, but also fight the long-term game, and also and challenge what it means to fight for youth voting rights, right? It's not just getting out the vote, but also this broader vision of democracy reform that we're all fighting for.
Let me ask Charlotte, as we're talking about younger voters, do you get the sense that we're at any sort of turning point where people are taking kind of younger voters more seriously now?
I do think people are taking younger voters more seriously, especially because particularly in the Democratic Party, there's this upswelling of this kind of young progressive wave that is, that's changing a lot of the Democratic priorities, the AOCs of the world, the Ilhan Omars of the world, the Ayanna Presleys of the world. I also think that, frankly, the 2020 primary illustrated kind of both the promise and the limits of the youth vote, because the Bernie Sanders campaign, one of their, real, core to their strategy was this idea that, American young people are universally progressive, which is not true. Many young people are extremely progressive, but there are also a lot of moderate young people, conservative young people, so there was this premise that, that there was this broad base of youth progressive support that would be enough to carry him to the presidential nomination. And it simply didn't turn out that way. Young voters did not turn out for Bernie Sanders in the way that the campaign really expected that they would. So one of the challenges for campaigns kind of looking at the youth vote is that then again, on the other side of the coin, you also have a race like the Ed Markey race just recently in Massachusetts, where his position on the Green New Deal earned him the support of the Sunrise Movement, and
and
that
AOC herself too, right?
And AOC herself, yes, exactly,
Yeah.
and that helped him win that race. That was going to be a really tough race. So I think it's tricky because on the one hand, and I'm curious what you two think about this, but it seems to me from just the outcomes of these races over the last couple of years, it seems like the most passionate base of support in the Democratic Party is also its least reliable. Sometimes young voters come out and deliver a huge win to somebody like, Bernie in Nevada or, Ed Markey. But to pin all of your hopes on the youth vote, there is just simply too much still standing in the way of young people voting in the numbers that older people vote for somebody like Bernie Sanders to win on that strategy.
Claudia, you probably saw a lot of that when you were working for the Elizabeth Warren campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, to Charlotte's point, we're a fantastic large voting bloc, but we're not all that reliable when it comes to we want X, Y, and Z, and that's important to recognize.
Yeah.
I think for the Warren campaign, right, she had a plan for everything. That was the whole joke. And that's with that plan for everything, we were trying to not just focus on one issue. In the case of Sanders, all young people are progressives, because they're not. And Charlotte's right about that. And I think for us, it was important to meet people where they were on each topic, whether that was climate change, whether that was the economy, taxing the wealthy, student debt, right? Student loans, that was a big thing that, we gained a lot of support for, because many students have student debt. And I think a lot of times while trying to kind of gear your campaign towards these older voters, we're kind of forgetting that young people have a lot of these issues that they want addressed in a very real way. And I think in the case of Ed Markey, he did that really well with the Green New Deal. And that's why he was able to kind of get this whole coalition of young people to support him against a Kennedy, no less, right? Which was historic.
Right.
And I think that is going to be kind of the golden ticket, is if you're able to get young people behind you, that's opens many doors for you.
So we had talked a little bit about sort of the progressive component, which I think plays into this notion of activism. And we kind of see these like two different approaches almost on how to make change, whether it's, incremental, some folks thinking incremental change is better. Some folks more, let's blow it up and throw out the rule book. And so give me your sense, I guess maybe I'll start with Brianna and then Charlotte. I know you've reported and talked about this, but your sense of those different approaches on activism as somebody who's kind of out there amongst, women voters and also younger voters, kind of this back and forth. It reminds me a little bit too of when we were talking about suffrage earlier, like the two different components of the early suffrage movement, where you had the Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, like, let's do this, through the process, let's, work through the process. And then the Alice Paul side was no, protests and hunger strikes and all the rest, right? And so how do you see those two components of young people who want to make change, but two ways to go about it? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something that we're always struggling with at Gen Vote. So we haven't figured it out either. But I think I want to touch upon what Charlotte mentioned earlier regarding the Green New Deal, right? So, I think what makes our generation, I'm talking as a Generation Z voter, but I think this also applies to millennials in the studies that have come out recently. Our generation tends to vote, we are more likely to vote based on issues than party. Right. So even if, Bernie Sanders, who's Democratic candidate, right, we evaluate candidates based on where they stand on issues. Are they, in Markey's case, are they a champion for progressive ideas like the Green New Deal, right? Or are they champions for the Black Lives Matter movement, in the current in this year. And so if we want to see young people really activate in mass numbers, I think we need to make sure that our leaders, whether it be those running for office or those even running organizations like ours, understand that young people are motivated by these big ideas that really can transform our society, right? Because I think 2020 has shown all of us, especially in the middle of this pandemic, that enough is enough and that we need to stand up. And that's why we saw so many people go out on the streets. I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I live right by Barclays Center. And so I was out there on the streets, demanding that our leaders were pushing the conversation for the movement for Black lives, right? And that we were talking about defunding the police and other solutions, right, within the movement. And so I think to activate young people, my perspective is that we do need to continue working and advocating for candidates that push these big transformative ideas and conversations. I think we have a lot of work to do in the voting space to get there. I think other spaces like the criminal justice space and the environmental space has figured this out with other youth-led movements. I think democracy space needs a little bit more work, but we can help us get there. And in the short term, though, telling young people, hey, if you want to defund the police, you still need to show up and vote. Like, voting is still an important part of the conversation. If you vote for this candidate, they can help repeal this legislation, right? Or help vote for this, if the city council vote for this budget. So I think it's connecting the issues that we're voting for on the ballot box and how those candidates can push those incremental changes for the bigger picture. That's kind of what we're always dealing with at Gen Vote and trying to figure out with our young people.
Right, but yet you also, you have the progressive side of things, but then you also have to realize like what's practical, right? What can actually get passed through, a two-party system that exists, right? And so, while you may support something like the Green New Deal, how do you actually get at least components of that maybe through?
And I think one thing I would also add is for folks to also think about how come young people, it's hard to grasp that understanding of like how this incremental change happens. Right. The civic education system in our country isn't the greatest. For decades, we have seen across the country, schools get their funding taken away and programs completely cut for educating our young people about how the system works. So we can't blame them when we tell them, if you want a Green New Deal, you need to understand how this body works and how this budget process works and how this works. It's not our fault. And so I think that's another important part of the conversation in terms of like the long-term piece here, not only how having organizations or organizers like us give resources for young people, but also what does it mean to grow up in our democracy? And if we want these big changes, you still need to invest in these smaller things, which ultimately will have hopefully big payoff with voter turnout.
Charlotte, what do you think? I know you talked a lot about this in your book and profile kind of different sorts of people with two different kind of approaches. What are your thoughts on kind of activism and advocating for change?
Yeah, so I hope it's okay to use bad language, but I'm just gonna go ahead with it. So in my book, I call them sort of these two different strains of how young people approach making change. One strain is fix the system. Work within the system, get elected to maybe a state or local office, slowly build power, build the connections with the work on the levels of power and see what you can get through. And I think a lot of older millennials in particular, particularly the ones who were, involved with the Obama administration, are very much in that vein. And I think the avatar for that would be like the Pete Buttigieg's of the world.
Mm-hmm.
People who are very much kind of about who exist in the realm of the possible and are about trying to get what they can get done given the existing constraints in our system. And then the other strain I call the fuck the system strain. And those fix the system, fuck the system. And and I think a lot of younger millennials and Gen Z are a little bit more in the fuck the system strain, which is much more about broad systemic overhaul. This idea, I trace it back to Occupy, but I think it sort of started really taking root at Occupy, kind of grew through the Black Lives Matter movement of 2013 and 2014, and really flourished in the Bernie Sanders campaign of 2016, and then in some of these young progressives who got elected in 2018. And so the thing that's really interesting about youth politics right now is watching these two strains kind of interact with each other, because you can't have all of one and you can't have all of the other. So, how is a Pete Buttigieg influenced by activists in his community who are demanding that he, for example, address policing problems in South Bend, or, expand his frame of what he thinks is possible? And how is somebody like AOC, who comes into Congress with a head full of steam, really acting more like an activist than a legislator, which I think is rad, but, but certainly, inhibits her ability to get a lot of things done. How is she sort of realizing, oh, wait, if I want the Green New Deal to be a reality and not just an idea, right, I have to talk to this person. I have to get this person on board. I have to put this thing in it. I have to ask, I have to bring in people who might not be natural allies. So watching those two, I really think, and one of the big arguments of my book is that, the Republican Party is sucking wind with young people right now. They are absolutely losing the youth vote. And for this rising generation of voters, for millennials and Gen Z, there certainly are conservative young people, but there are not that many of them. And the real tension in these two generations is going to be between the sort of more activisty approach and the more pragmatic approach.
Claudia, what are your thoughts on that? And also, sort of, how do you see kind of the movement politics of late, where, especially among younger people, there's more of a focus on a movement, not necessarily with a particular leader, right? So, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, these are sort of movements that people get caught up in. How do you see those kind of impacting politics as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Charlotte said, right? So there's definitely our two camps, and I think oftentimes they clash, right? Yeah. And I think it's hard. And I think I personally am more in the realm of the possible, right? I love that a good amount of my friends are in the let's burn the system to the ground and start from scratch. But I also recognize that there's a good part, there are other people other than young people who are involved in these political decision making. And I think that we need to work hand in hand with them to get this done. I don't think that means that we don't take certain issues and say, no, we're going super extreme. Gun rights, right? And making sure that we have legislation that doesn't put guns in the hands of the wrong people. Absolutely. There should be no discussion. It should be full force AOC. But I think that it's also important that you kind of meet somewhere, not necessarily in the middle, but somewhere where we can actually, see these kind of dreams become a reality. And I think the movements are really fantastic, right? Look at everything that these young people, March for Our Lives is a great example, right? How young people really took this issue and ran with it. And that is their sphere, right? This is their issue that they're saying, we're done having older people tell us how we're going to do this. We're done with our voices not being heard. And if you guys aren't going to do anything about it, we're taking matters into our own hands. And I love it. I'm here for it. And I think that as we continue on, especially, pending the results of the November election, we're going to see a lot more of that. We're going to see a lot more of people saying, enough, we're done, with traditional politics and government, and this is how it's going to be done. And I'm excited to see, what that evolves into, especially because I think, millennials and especially Gen Z, right? I'm a millennial, Charlotte's a millennial. Brianna's a Gen Zer, right? And they are really taking this world by storm. And I'm excited to see, what comes of that.
I want to remind everybody that we're going to have some time for questions in just a minute. So if you want to submit a question, we will get to those in just a minute. But I want to ask quickly before we go to questions, each of your thoughts on sort of this era of COVID that we are living in now, and how it's impacting, voters, how it's impacting, certainly we've seen firsthand now the importance and the power of responsibility that's placed in elected officials, from the president on down to mayors and city council people. But we've had less of an opportunity in many ways to kind of be out and participate in politics on the ground, person to person, getting out the vote, grassroots vote, door knocking, those kind of things, even rallies for the most part. are not been happening. And also this, component of this disproportionate level of struggling that's happening, especially among women and young mothers as well. So I want to get each of your thoughts on that, and then I think we will go to some questions. Claudia, you want to start?
Sure, and then I actually have a question for you, but I'll wait for my other panelists to finish. But no, I think that's a really great question, right? COVID is something that I know I personally never thought I would deal with in my lifetime. Yeah. And it's, this unheard of pandemic that has just wreaked havoc across the board. And I think for me, the issue that I care about is people of color, right? COVID is affecting people of color at a different rate than it's affecting white people.
Yeah.
Plain and simple. And I think that right now I'm looking for leadership that addresses that, right? That addresses the fact that there should be the amount of unemployment benefits that people are getting, right? It's the fact that now with COVID, people are now doing school remote. Who's most affected by that, right? People of color who might not necessarily have the same technological advantages of their white counterparts. So for me, that, is a bigger part of an issue that we need to address, which also goes to say representation matters, right? I want to see more people who look like me in government, right? Because they understand the issues that we're facing at a very direct level. I don't want another white guy telling me, what the Latina experience is and how he thinks we should all go back to work. That's not happening. For me, it's always been a very particular issue, my culture. And I would hope that young people, especially young people of color, are taking that into account in their political activism and engagement.
Great. Brianna, what about you?
Yeah, so COVID, it's definitely been an unprecedented year for our students who have been trying to organize the youth vote for this, probably the most important election of our lifetime, at least the one that I've seen so far, right? And for many folks, grappling with this idea of how do we engage first-time voters during this unprecedented health crisis, which disproportionately affects communities of color and young Black and brown voters. And while we're trying to grapple with all of this, we can't even do this in person in many of our campuses. So, we have been dealing with this and we learned a lot during the primaries. A lot of our Gen voters organized in New York State, and we saw a ton of confusion. A lot of young people, this was their first time not only voting in a presidential primary, but also voting by mail. This was their first time also, for some folks, working as poll workers who stepped up during the primaries. And so, what we're hoping is that with this upcoming election, it's super important for young people to recognize that with misinformation, fears around COVID, and just broadly confusion about how to vote and where to vote, we really need young people to step up. Right? We need young people to step up and protect our communities, to protect our vote. And so at Gen Vote, what we are asking, if you're a young person on this call, please step up. And if you feel safe and able and not putting your families at risk or yourself at risk, sign up to be an election worker if you can. And if you can't be an election worker, at least check out organizations like Generation Vote and others to find out how to vote and get that information to your friends and your families. And so that's my biggest thing I wanted to flag for folks here. And as a young Asian American woman, I think one thing that made me hopeful is also, I think Claudia brought representation. That made me think of this. I also hope that we see more folks like myself showing up to the polls. Usually young Asian American voters tend to have the lowest turnout amongst all young people. And so recent studies have shown and polls have shown that young Asian Americans in the face of this crisis have realized how important it is to vote for local officials that deal with these crises in our local communities. And I'm hoping that my families and my friends step up and be able to help folks who look like us and vote people that look like us into office this November.
Right, great. And Charlotte, covering politics in this era must be so strange, right?
It is really strange. I had COVID a couple months ago. I'm fine. I have the antibodies, and that's really the only reason that I can do this road trip. Especially because a lot of people are not wearing masks.
Right.
But I have a sort of a wacky, out of left field take on this, which is that I think one of the big takeaways from this COVID time,
Yeah.
And I agree with everything Brianna and Claudia said also, but I think one of the big takeaways is going to be that that there are a lot of jobs actually where you can do this work from anywhere.
Right.
You know, remote work is going to be something that isn't going to be possible for every industry, but is going to be radically expanded in terms of, you know, where people can live and where they work. And so what I wonder, and truly, I don't know if anybody's working on this. This is just like, these are just the things that pop through my head as I'm driving across the country, is I'm like, why, you know, if you no longer have to live in San Francisco to work at Twitter,
Right.
or live in, you know, New York City, or to work at Facebook, or or live in Seattle, or to work at Amazon, I wonder why there's not more of an exodus of young people to some of these very sparsely populated states where even just a couple thousand new voters could radically tip the balance of power in the Senate.
And especially even in the Electoral College, because
and the Electoral College,
that's significant, is, you know, we're so concentrated in these cities.
Yes.
That could definitely make a difference.
I mean, even like, you know, my hobby horse is Wyoming.
Yeah.
You know, Wyoming has 2 senators and, you know, a fraction of the population of California or New York. And even, you know, if I was thinking this when Amazon was thinking of moving their headquarters. Amazon, if they had picked someplace different to move their headquarters, could have literally reshaped the balance of power in the United States government. Because if they had put their headquarters in Idaho or in Wyoming or in South Dakota and attracted a lot of young liberal voters to those places where their vote matters way more than it does in Brooklyn, where I also live. Brianna, I think I'm your neighbor. You know, I think when we're talking about young voters and we're talking about the issues that matter to them, and we're talking about the power of their vote, we cannot ignore geography, because there is a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and engagement, and it's real and it's there and it's shaping the political conversation. But the reason that it's not getting translated into power structures in the way that young people want it to is because it's so concentrated in these areas that are already blue.
Right.
So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter as much in the system that we've created for this. Right. So anyway, that's what's on my mind.
Right. Claudia, you had a question?
I did. So I was just gonna, you know, to close us off, but just ask, with your years of experience, what more you think, you know, young women can do to push this political ball forward as it relates to political engagement. And to your point, as it relates to COVID, right? In this very new world we're living in where traditional methods are no longer possible.
I mean, to me, I've just seen, you know, so much more organization among young people than I've ever seen in my lifetime. Certainly my generation wasn't this organized and specific about voting. It wasn't even really talked about. And so you guys, your generation, I just think is on top of it in a really great way. And so that seems super optimistic for me, because, you know, you know, when I was growing up, people were interested in politics, but there was no sort of coming around together. And, you know, of course, you know, the internet has, you know, made everything in terms of communication, organizing, so much more efficient and available for people. And that's been a huge change. So I just feel like, you know, young people are on a good track, and things like you guys are doing, and Brianna, all the work that she's doing to, you know, let young people know the importance of it and what's at stake, and that, you know, you can't just sit back. If you're not happy with something, you have to make a difference, you know, and stand up for things. So I just think that more and more young people, I think, and certainly the students that I see in my class are all very attuned to that in a good way. So thank you. Let's see, we have some time, just a little bit of time for some questions. So let me see what we have here. Let's see. Here's a question from Raphael. Have you found examples in this election season of voter suppression directed specifically towards women? Anybody want to take that one? Brianna, maybe?
Towards women.
Yes. Voter suppression specifically toward women.
I cannot say if I can point to specific voter disenfranchisement laws targeted at women voters in particular. Most of the attacks that we have seen against our right to vote are usually targeted specifically at young people, because young people in a lot of communities tend to vote liberal.
Right.
And so we do see, but we have seen intentional and non-intentional voter suppression in liberal states. So I will say that as well, against young people. And the second, probably the one that most folks are aware of, ways that we see attacks against our right to vote is against, voters in communities of color, right? So specifically against Black voters, right? Against voters in predominantly Latinx constituencies. And so I would say actually that most of the voter attacks that we have seen have been specifically targeted along those two lines. I'm not so sure against women, within those groups. I mean, I can say that a lot of these voter disenfranchisement laws disproportionately affect women. So for example, let's say you're in a state where they are cutting back early voting sites, right? Think about the single mothers that have to then figure out, how can I vote if I cannot vote early and I only have, the 6 hours, 7 hours to vote on election day when I have to pick up my kids.
Right.
So I would say the impact is definitely disproportionately felt by.
But it's not deliberate, but not
exactly.
deliberate. Yeah.
Right.
Great. Okay. Let me move on to another one. What can the older suburban community members do to assist in the efforts to inform students of voting rights and possibilities at local colleges, while of course being safe during the pandemic? Anybody want to weigh in on that? Do you have any thoughts on that, Claudia?
Yeah, actually, I was Charlotte, who's been traveling around the country, might have a better idea. But yeah, I definitely think it's finding engagement in any way possible, whether that's, again, things are different. So a lot is happening over Zoom. But I would say, anytime you run into somebody, if there's any events that are on campus, I know colleges are being very weird with the pandemic, but I attend, right? Volunteer to host a drive-through where people can sign up to vote, or if people have questions about where they can, where their nearest poll site is, or, what the process is, as Brianna mentioned earlier, educating people about what the process is to get their vote in, to make sure that their vote is counted, and start early, right? A lot of questions are coming about mail-in voting. The best thing we can do is get people educated and make sure that their ballots are in now, right? Not that we're waiting to right close to the election so we encounter more problems. But if you haven't, I'm talking to everybody on this chat who's watching, please, if you're not voting in person, figure out how you're able to get your absentee ballot and submit it and mail it in as quickly as possible.
Charlotte, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. And I think that my answer to this is actually the same answer that I would give to anybody who asks me anything about what they can do to help in American politics, which is to find a state representative or a state Senate candidate that you believe in, and give that person money and time. Because I think particularly when we're talking about college students, and I think Brianna probably knows this better than anybody, unfortunately, I don't know that college students are like looking to their, older people who live in their college town for cues on what to do. What is true is that the voter suppression laws that Brianna is talking about that disenfranchise these young voters are made at the state level. And the people running for those state house seats their campaigns are super underfunded. So, donations that, you might make to a presidential campaign that would be a drop in the bucket to a state or local candidate could be 10% of their entire operating budget. But more importantly, particularly in the time of COVID, these state and local campaigns are actually doing physical door knocking and physical organizing in these key swing communities. And we know that Joe Biden in particular is not doing that. There's something called reverse coattails, which is that people tend to think, oh, you know, I'm going to go out and vote for Barack Obama for president. And then while I'm there, I guess I'll vote for whoever else is on the ticket, whatever Democrat is there.
Right.
But the opposite is also true. So for example, you could have, I'm just going to use Brianna since you're an incredible organizer, but like, you know, let's say Brianna is running for a state representative seat. She might be going all around her district, getting to know all the people in her community, sitting in their living room, talking to their dog, commenting on their garden. And maybe they weren't sure if they were going to vote that year, but they're like, oh, Brianna just keeps
I met her. Yeah.
coming by. I guess I got to
Monday.
show up and vote for Brianna. And then while they're there, they might vote up the ballot for governor and Joe Biden. So that's what I would say. Local.
Yeah. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Brianna? Since this is your area of expertise.
Yeah, I mean, I have lots to add there, but also thank you, Charlotte, for that little example. One day, who knows? And that's also, I think that point about investing in local candidates is super important. That's why I started Gen Vote. Gen Vote started because I had a local candidate running for county executive, hyper local race in 2016, ask me, how can we engage young people in local politics? I was a freshman at the time. I had no idea what I was doing. Didn't even know what the local legislature was or county executive was. And I created this model of engagement to train young people to get interested in this very local race. And the only way I was able to do that was because our campaign had funding and folks who are investing in the young organizers and in order to make this happen. And we broke records. We increased turnout by over 300% at my university at in that election. So that I have that lived experience, Charlotte. That was great, and I wanted to share that as just to support that answer. And in terms of what I would say to that question, I think that's spot on as well. You know, we're helping young people, whether it be through the League of Women Voters. I know they do a lot of work connecting older folks outside of college campuses with university vote committees, which check them out in your local colleges to see if they have anything like that, like NYU Votes. And so just like do your research, see what local voting organizations exist. Indivisibles across the country have also been engaging in more voter engagement work with college students. And usually on college campuses, a good place to start is reaching out to the vote committees or the civic engagement offices to see how you can best plug your organization in with the young people on that campus. Young people tend to trust more people affiliated with the university, so I would start there.
And the website, just so everybody knows, for the League of Women Voters, voter and voting information is vote411.org, just so everyone has that. Let's see. I think we have time for one more question here. This is from Alan. He says, soldiers have been voting by mail courier since the Civil War. As voters, how should we prepare for the time it may take for us to get the results? What comes to mind for you? Charlotte is a journalist. I mean, when are we gonna know the results of this election?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I'm really worried about.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I think it could take, I think it likely will take days. It could take weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I also think that, you know, it really seems like the Trump campaign, the Trump voters that I'm talking to plan to vote in person. That is their plan for voting. And so, frankly, I understand why Democrats are heavily leaning into vote by mail, and they totally should for all of the public health reasons that we all know about. But I also wonder why Democrats are not encouraging younger, healthy voters who feel safe to vote in person if they can. Because I truly don't think at this point in the pandemic that voting you know, with a mask, with gloves, sanitized, moving fast is a particularly high risk COVID activity, especially if you're not somebody who has a pre-existing condition, or you're not somebody who's at elevated risk for COVID, or, you know, 85 years old or something. So I'm frankly, you know, surprised that there isn't more nuance in the kind of game plan being given to Democratic voters. There isn't more like, if you feel like you are healthy and you're comfortable, you know, for example, if you're going out to bars outside, you should be putting on a mask to go and vote in person. Like, if you're not locked in your home, not seeing anybody because you are immunocompromised, and if that's your situation, definitely do that. Like, if you're going to the store, if you're going to restaurants, if you're going to small birthday parties, like, you should try to vote in person.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Is that good advice, Brianna and Claudia, you think?
Yes, I think it's definitely, I worry. I mean, to Charlotte's point, I fear an Iowa caucus situation in November, and that's something that we should all kind of mentally prepare for, because I don't doubt that the results will be contested.
Yeah.
I will say, as a young person, a fact that not many folks know, but I think it's super important because it's happened in 2016. I believe in 2016, 1 in 4 millennial voters reported out saying that they voted provisionally. They had to vote by provisional ballot. And at Gen Vote, we definitely encourage students to educate their communities about if there are 3 ways to vote, by mail, in person, and early, to do that. I tend to also, based on what Charlotte said about voting early, young people tend to have higher rejection rates when it comes to our absentee ballots. There's a lot of reasons why.
Right.
And so I'm very cautious whenever I see organizations that aren't usually used to working with young people start shouting at young people, being like, vote by mail, and then you realize, oh shoot, young people don't have stamps. We don't know how to.
Or they've gotten, they've moved several times. Lots of different residencies. If you're in college and you're here and there. Yeah.
In some states, in 7 states, if you're under the age of 65, you can't even vote by mail. So people are super confused when they see that, right? So, I think we just have to make sure that we are educating folks about all the different options and not pushing them just to vote by mail, especially because of the issues that young people face.
Yeah.
And I would also urge people, I'm thinking of the Georgia primary, that if you you go to vote in person and that there's a 2-hour line, I urge you to stay in line, right? Take a stand for democracy. Don't walk away. It's, it's an unfortunate, incident when things at polling places don't go according to plan. But I would urge everyone, if you do as you should, and if you can vote in person, please stay in line and take a stand for democracy.
Well, taking a stand for democracy is a perfect way to end. And I know Claudia has to go to class, so good luck in class, Claudia. And thank you, Brianna, and thank you, Charlotte and Ellen and everybody at NYU. And thanks everybody for watching, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.